A project's underway in cities around the country to measure the effect of climate change on land areas. It's called the heat island effect, and it's found mainly in areas with fewer trees or more buildings and pavement. To tell us about the efforts to map and measure what's happening around Boston are the program manager for communities responding to extreme weather, Reverend Vernon K. and the manager of forums and national conversations at the Museum of Science, David Sittenfeld. Thank you both for being with us.
No, glad to be here.
Thanks for having us on today.
I want to start with David, the scientific part of this for people who don't get it yet. What exactly is a heat island?
So there are different parts of communities that tend to experience hot weather differently because of the urban form of the places where we live. Places where there's a lot of built pavement, especially far away from water that are unshaded, tend to heat up more quickly. And some areas persist hotter through the evenings. And this has impacts on infrastructure and public health for people who are, living through these hot events.
Reverend, this is a problem for everybody, but if you think about in terms of the city of Boston here, I guess this is going to affect some people more than others.
Yes, absolutely. Places like Dorchester, which was proven from the study to be the hottest area, around about 102 degrees Fahrenheit, which is extremely hot. So in places like Dorchester that do not necessarily have tree shade to help people cool down, it gets disproportionately hotter than it would in a place such as Brookline.
Right. And David, Dorchester has a lot of three-deckers. If you're up on the third floor of a three-decker in the dog days of August, what's that mean?
So, it's a good question that you're asking. What we measured was temperature at people height, ambient height of about 6 feet or so, as you would experience if you're, walking around or riding on a bike on the surface of a street during a day. But of course, we know that people experience these heat waves, especially at night when they're indoors. And so we know, as Reverend Walker says, that people are going to disproportionately be experiencing heat waves when you're in a place, for example, like a triple-decker that doesn't have air conditioning. So while we found pretty big differences in terms of what people are experiencing, sometimes at the hottest parts of the day, up to 17 degrees Fahrenheit different between the coolest and warmest areas of the city as we recorded temperatures and then modeled them all at the same time of the day, there are certain things that people are experiencing, even within a sub-block level that can be done to really, sort of ease the burden, both in terms of how much they have to cool their homes or what the impacts can be from a public health perspective.
Pick up on that because if you have more detailed information about where the heat is at its worst and what needs to be done, I guess that makes it easier to ask for remedies, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and that's what we do at the at the CREW program, Communities Responding to Extreme Weather. We look to work with organizations that have a physical space, trusted organizations in the community that have a physical space that will open their doors during extreme weather emergency or during heat waves, for example, and to become a cooling center. We have relationships with faith-based communities in Dorchester and other parts of the state. We have relationships with nonprofits and an agreement in place to become a cooling center, a refuge, because as David was saying, it becomes increasingly difficult to withstand a heat wave when a person does not have an air conditioner in their home. And we know who are the folks that are disproportionately affected are elders, people of color, and low-income communities who feel the burden the most and who carry the heaviest burden because of the extreme weather that is produced by a heat wave.
Right. David, I guess this is another thing, when you find out how rough it is on certain buildings, then I guess the next logical step is you got to change the way things are built or designed, right?
There are a few things that can easily be done when you find these areas that are popping up as hotspots around the city. And as Reverend Walker says, this is really good information for urban planners to have at their fingertips as they consider what can be done in the next few years and then on a multi-decade strategy. There are certain things that can easily be done in terms of building materials and improving electrical infrastructure, for example, in the short run, so that if you do have have an area that's going to be, needs to have one of these resilience hubs that Reverend Walker is talking about, you make sure that that is an area that's prioritized in terms of, short-term code upgrades and what have you. But then there are things that can be done more sort of long-term in terms of trying to build in water features or green space and zoning changes that can be done, because one of the things that we found is that, unsurprisingly, you get a little bit further away from the water and you see bigger swings in temperatures. That's basic physics and something to be expected. But shade really has a major impact, at least in the maps that we've been creating through these volunteer-led heat mapping campaigns. And in addition to shade, the existence of green space or not seems to make a big difference. And so while it might be a pretty big ask in just a year or two to resurface an entire area, there are things that can be done in the short run to help with the infrastructural needs, and things that can be done in the longer term to really try to transform a neighborhood so that it can become resilient.
Reverend, I want to hear more about the public health effect. People have been talking for years about asthma. I imagine people with cardiovascular problems have it worse too. So what do you see in the future with heat islands?
Well, it exacerbates the problem for those who suffer from asthma and those who suffer from cardiovascular issues and those who are elderly, because climate change is going to continuously get worse and worse according to the science. We are going to see more extreme weather manifest in the form of heat waves, manifest in the form of floods, manifest in the form of severe winters here in New England. So essentially, I think it would be prudent for people to prepare for the extreme weather that is coming as a result of climate change. And we understand that there is no coincidence that when you see a power plant in a community, there is a greater risk of asthma among children because the air is being polluted by the toxins that are pitted by power plants. So essentially, I think it would be wise and judicious for people to begin to prepare for these heat waves. And one of the ways to do it is to consider joining what we call a crew team. A crew team is a neighborhood team that is composed of residents from a given community that are interested in building the social fabric of the community and strengthening the social network among neighbors. So when extreme weather does happen, people and folks are doing wellness checks on each other to ensure that no one perish from extreme weather such as heat waves.
David, one of the other things that struck me in this initiative is about the nighttime effect, because we all know the difference between a shade tree and a parking lot on a hot summer day, but what is it about the nighttime temperatures that has you worried?
We're still really looking into this because it's fascinating to dive into these data sets that have been created by these volunteers. So to give a tiny bit of background about where this information comes from, the methodology was developed by researchers at Portland State University and the Science Museum of Virginia. And what happens is we actually have wonderful people, Reverend Walker was one of them, who give of their time to get into a car and drive around for an hour at 3 different times during the day. And those 3 times were 6 a.m., 3 p.m., and 7 p.m. And the 7 p.m. time is intended, as is the 6 a.m., to get a sense of what you're asking about. What happens in these communities during the time when normally the heat from the city would give itself up to the atmosphere? When you have times where the temperature really doesn't drop very much because of heat island effects and other things like waste heat, what happens is that this really has exacerbating effects on public health. These are the times when, for example, we're stuck indoors, as you may have mentioned before, and in places where you have communities where people may be isolated, like you have high senior citizen population or people who may be disconnected, it's difficult for them to call for help. And the other thing I think to mention about these evening temperatures, which tend to exacerbate public health effects, is that, as Reverend Walker says, these hazards are not happening by themselves. They're cumulative. And so if you live in a part of the city where, you have asthma and you're also experiencing very high temperatures, this can have multiple effects on public health. health, and so it tends to stress infrastructures and social networks. So this idea of trying to find out which parts of the city are warming up the most and which parts of the city are not cooling down as much, we're finding that there's kind of a magic triangle here. Get further away from water, find places that are unshaded so they really heat up during the day, and then these areas which are characterized by a lot of built environment from buildings and especially highways seem to really be the ones that are characterized by these very high evening temperatures.
Reverend, there's this effort to measure the heat island effects, but also the rising sea levels in Boston. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, and I guess why it matters to get people involved and maybe to think of things differently.
Yes. So not only is heat waves a result of climate change, but also sea level rise. And we know that Boston is surrounded by water, and we know, according to the science, that certain parts of Boston will be underwater, such as Back Bay, such as the Seaport District, and parts of Dorchester, which already currently flood, will unfortunately experience neighborhoods will unfortunately experience being underwater. But there is things that we can do about this, such as, and we can be proactive instead of reactive. And one of the ways that people and folks can be proactive is connecting not only with the communities responding to extreme weather and learning about building social connectivity in a localized community, but also there's an event at the Museum of Science on March 3rd, I believe, called the Rising King Tide, and that's on the website, Museum of Science website, where people are going around and taking pictures of areas that flood in the Boston and Greater Boston area, and I think people should be concerned because as we know, because of climate change, sea level is rising, is impacting communities at a rate that we've never seen before. And because of such, I think it would be prudent for us to prepare for a sea level rise.
And finally, you got some information on the Crew website, right?
Yes, if folks want more information about communities responding to extreme weather, please check out www.climatecrew.org.
And you've got things at the museum website too, David, right?
We do. If you go to mos.org, you can find details about the event that Reverend Walker mentioned. It's called Wicked High Tides. And as he said, there's opportunities for people to go out and document where we're seeing sunny day floods right now, even without storms. Sometimes on places like Morrissey Boulevard, you go through when there's a high tide or when a storm comes in. And this is really important information for us to know about because it helps urban planners know which areas could be made more resilient today.
Thank you both very much, David Sittenfeld and Reverend Vernon K. Walker. In a moment, a new report about the toll of gambling on Asian American communities. But first, this message.